thought most of you people would have more wit, more sense on a good night. Not just that you should be around the river, but those of you who are of such inclination should have been in Dublin at the Rolling Stones.
We were there in spirit.
We were there in spirit.
We were.
John Hume taught me history for 2 years. I was a very young man, and he was a young teacher. And for the first year that he taught me history, I think it was probably one of the best learning experiences I had. The second year wasn't so good. The first year he challenged those of us who were in the history class to go beyond ourselves and go past the dates and the characters of history and to explore the realities and the current affairs of that particular time. I remember one time I had to speak in a debate that he put in front of us about nationalists should join the Unionist Party and change it from within. That was way back in the late 1950s. So those were the challenges. In that summer, John then became, I think, first summer of those 2 years. After a year of very good teaching, he became, I think, president of the credit union, and perhaps on a Sunday night he'd have been in Cork. And he would have come back in on a Monday morning very tired. And he would have reverted to the books, as they said, so that you ended up reading kind of the dates and learning the dates and the rather boring pieces about history. So I'm going to do a little bit of both tonight. The boring bits are the dates and the times, and hopefully a little bit of exploration beyond that into some of the meaningfulness and the currency and the import of history. And there's really 3 dates that I want to kind of concentrate on. One is the Government of Ireland Act of December 1920. And the second one is the Good Friday Agreement of the 10th of April 1998. And the third one is the Brexit referendum of the 23rd of June 1916. I want to, in some ways, weave something around those 3 dates and those 3 events. This island was partitioned, as we know, and it was partitioned under that act of the Government of Ireland Act, which took place in December 1920. I think the actual date, if my memory serves me right, was the 20th of December 1920. That was when partition became formalised, when the actual 2 governments were set up and the 2 parts of Ireland were established. And there are many complex issues around that issue, all of which we have kind of lived in conjunction with over the last 100 years, because it is almost 100 years since that act, 1920. Almost 100 years. We're getting very close to the celebration or to the anniversary or to the commemoration, and people will call it different things in 2 years' time, which will be 100 years around that establishment. But one of the things that actually was of import then, and which is importing upon us now, it's impacting upon us in a fairly immense way, was the head count, the numerical decision, the decision as to what would be included in Northern Ireland and what would be excluded in Northern Ireland. And that was based mostly on a head count. Carson, for example, who was one of the main spokespeople, one of the main leaders, believed that 4 counties would have been sufficient. I think they were Antrim, Derry, Antrim, Antrim, and Down, I think, were his 4 choices. Craig, on the other hand, who became the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, was very, very definite that the British option, particularly by Balfour and a few of the other main politicians within England at the time, that their option, which would have been for Ulster, which would have been 9 counties, that would not be the situation that he would not agree to 9 counties being the partitioned state, even though it was a region and an entity that had a kind of historical reality to it. Ulster was Ulster. He opted for 6 counties. And he opted for 6 counties on the grounds that if you went for the 9 counties, the balance would be too small. The relationship between Catholics and Protestants, between Unionists and Nationalists, would be too small. There wouldn't be a large enough gap. And that would carry danger in the coming years. And that's what was agreed. He actually won that argument. And the 6 counties was what became the partition part of it, what became known as the 6 counties. And people referred to it as the 6 counties. Northern Ireland, or the North, as some people prefer to call it. It's interesting to look at the figures at that time, the numerical figures, the demographics of that particular period. There were 420,000 Catholics in that 6 counties. 420,000 out of a population of 1,250,000, 257,000. And that was 34% of the population in those 6 counties Catholic. If it had been the 9 counties, it would have been, the percentage would have been 45% to 55%. And the decision, or the opinion, particularly of Craig, was that that was too close. And that would create problems down the line. So that's, in some ways, was the historical, part of the historical reality of that 100 years ago. And those were the figures. Interestingly enough, in 1971, which was close to the breakout of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, as we now refer to them, the percentage of the population as regards Catholics and Protestants was basically the same. It was 34% of the population was Catholic, and the rest were Unionists or Protestants, whatever they referred to themselves. So very little had changed in the demographics in those intervening years. By 2001, which is 30 years later, the Catholic population, nationalist population, had risen to 43.8%, which was a major increase within a relatively short period of time. By 2011, which is the last census that we have, that had increased to 45%. And as we stand at the moment, the last figures that we can rely on is that the nationalist population in Northern Ireland is 45%, and the Unionist population in Northern Ireland is 48%. The rest is people who are from neither of those two traditions or cultures or backgrounds. And we also know that that gap is narrowing, and narrowing fast. There's an interesting piece of work done by a very good scholar in Queen's University in Belfast, Paul Nolan. You may have seen him on the news recently. You may have seen his research recently. And Paul Nolan is claiming, based on research, that by the anniversary of the setting up of the Northern Ireland state, the nationalist community will outnumber the Unionist community. So by the year 2021, even though it was 2020, it was December, and the anniversary will be in 2021, and that's when the Unionist community intends to actually celebrate or commemorate the setting up of the state. The Catholics will have, by that stage, outnumbered, outgrown, outpopulated, whatever word one prefers to adapt, but that the change will have been complete within that 100 years. And he bases that on a number of interesting facts. He says that Catholics, and this is a recent survey that he's undertaken, is that the number of workers in Northern Ireland at the moment, of the totality, 44% are Catholic. nationalists, and 40% are Protestants. That's among the workers in Northern Ireland. Among the school children in Northern Ireland, 51% are Catholic, 37% are Protestant, which is an amazingly big gap. And the over 60s, which is very important also. The over 60s, 57, the only place where Protestants outnumber everybody is from the over 60s, which is not good if you want to be within that range. 57% are Protestant and 35% are Catholic, which means that the Catholic population is a younger population than the Protestant population. And based on those surveys and on those findings, Paul Noland is saying that by 2021, the demographics will have changed to the extent where nationalists, Catholics, whatever you want to call them, non-unionists, will in fact outnumber those who are Protestants, unionists, so forth. That's very important in the sense that it feeds into something which I will try to touch upon later on. But I want to kind of jump forward a bit. Even though, dear God, I was hoping to avoid moments like this. You're very welcome.
Sorry,
I will leave that for others to decide. Those years have passed. We know people have their views as to what Northern Ireland was like, what Ireland was like, what it went through, what the relationships between North and South were over all those intervening years. But what we do know is that by 1970, troubles had broken out once again, particularly in Northern Ireland. And in that relationship, around the Anglo-Irish relationship between those who felt that they were British and those who felt that they were Irish. And that's a great generalisation. There are many subdivisions, of course, within that. But given that broad generalisation, the Troubles broke out again, and it was almost 30 years later before we moved towards some kind of reconciliation, some kind of peacemaking, some kind of trouble-making aside, in that we were trying to actually resolve and stop the killing and the troubles and all that goes with it. And again, like any piece of history, like any moment in history, it is complex. And you cannot, a good historian would slap you across the wrist for tying it down to one particular event, or for tying the trend down to one particular event. But given that we haven't time and we haven't space, and we're not historians, and we don't have to be as pure as that, I would put the changing moment down to one big moment which hasn't received all that much attention. And that happened in 1990. And I happen to be fairly around it, in that there had been for a long number of years a kind of a backlink between the British government and the IRA. And in 1990, a man called, famous for singing a song on the Late Late Show, called Peter Brooks, sent a letter through the link to the IRA of a speech that he was going to give, that he was going to deliver in Coleraine on a particular night. And in that speech, he was going to refer something, and he wanted the IRA to know that he was making this speech and that they should note this particular sentence. And the sentence was that the British government has no selfish, strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. And in many ways, that one sentence was the beginning of the possibility of dialogue and negotiations between the two extremes, as I would interpret them. The people who had the ability and who actually were involved and were the main protagonists within the Northern Ireland Troubles. One was the British government and the other was the IRA. There are many subdivisions within that, but those were the two antagonists, who at that stage were refusing to engage with each other. Even though they had engaged in 1975 with each other, that had kind of fallen apart and had its consequences, and now it was coming together in 1990. So Peter Brook's statement led to a situation whereby people were talking to each other. It was quiet at the start, it was secretive at the start, and gradually it moved into a public space. The political parties were antagonistic towards it at the start, and then that moved into a public space. We know the Hume Adams talks, we know the then beginning talks that ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement. It took the best part of 8 years, between 1990 and 1998. But these things don't happen quickly. When things are as deeply rooted as our troubles have been, or our differences have been, these things don't. And they have false starts quite often. And they have many starts. And they have many manifestations. And sometimes you think that they're falling apart, and sometimes you think that they are regrouping themselves. But the interesting thing, I think, that when you look back at history, is that you can see trends, and you can see markers that change the contour of the road, that change the actual flow of the river, or that change the temperature, which allows people to do things that they perhaps wouldn't have done up on and including those moments. So by that stage, 8 years after that particular speech, we had the Good Friday Agreement. And then the years that followed that, we had good days and we had bad days. We had developments that took us by surprise at times, McGuinness, Paisley. We had institutions up and running. We had an assembly, we had an executive. We had two governments involved for a long period of time, and then two governments relating to each other, and so forth. All of that was happening over those years. There was then beginning things like, could we and were we creating a new reality on this island? Were we creating a place called Northern Ireland, where people were settling down and actually creating an identity around Northern Ireland, where they weren't completely British and they weren't completely Irish? And was there a new possibility that this was the way forward? People began to feel that the two governments had kind of become lazy around the situation, and there was things happening that perhaps were ill-conceived and so forth, but that in general there was a coming together, a closeness, and that politics, even though it wasn't brilliant, it was better than what it had been. And people were flying throughout the world and saying Northern Ireland's a great place, come and live here, come and build your factories here, come and put your money here, this is the place to be. And all of that was kind of hopeful and creative in its own way, because it showed the possibility that people could live together. Whether it was fully real and whether it was fully touchable is a big question. And I think that will have to be left to history. My own feeling is that the Anglo-Irish, the British-Irish situation could never have been resolved only within the narrow context of Northern Ireland. My own feeling was that Ireland and Britain had to resolve this at a deeper level than the Good Friday Agreement. But that the rest that the Good Friday Agreement had given us, and the indicators that it had given us, and the good days that it has given us, were important within their own right. And they showed that which was possible, and they showed that perhaps which was desirable. For example, again, just out of my own experience, within the Good Friday Agreement there was two things that were not resolved, that were put aside and said, we'll resolve it in a different way. One was policing, and the other was the past, how you deal with the past in Northern Ireland. And Fortunately or unfortunately, I got involved in both. The policing one, I think we resolved reasonably well. The last time I looked, I think that the response was that about 80% of people in Northern Ireland had a strong trust of policing. Now, within any country, 80% is quite strong. So that seemed to resolve itself reasonably well. The past, we never got off the starting blocks. Because in many ways we were fighting those old antagonisms, those old entrenched identity issues about Britishness and Irishness, or unionism and nationalism. And in many ways we fought a moral battle about who had the right to do things and who were wrong, who were the goodies and who were the baddies. We created things like hierarchy of victims, and we couldn't settle for the fact that you shouldn't give money to this group of people, and you couldn't give money to that group of people, and you couldn't give a pension to that group of people, and you can't release this group of people, and those people shouldn't be interrogated by the police anymore. It goes from a situation whereby a lot of anger around former paramilitaries being released under the Good Friday Agreement to a situation of where there's a big antagonistic situation happening at the moment, whereby many within the Conservative Party and many within England want former soldiers not ever to be prosecuted, no matter what they've ever been involved in. So we go to the extremes in all of that. We didn't handle that very well, and in many ways, by not handling that, I think that we always left potholes all over the place, large potholes for us to fall into. And any time that a storm came up, we fell into the potholes. And therefore, I think that having not resolved the past, the likelihood of resolving a future that was final, that was terminal in that sense, was very, very, very unlikely. And the interesting thing is that a thing came along which kind of blew, and the house was perhaps not strong enough to survive, and that thing is called Brexit, which brings me to the third place, or the third date within this kind of overview of things. Brexit is such a complex issue, and there's been so much written about it, and there's so many commentators have written about it. It's hard to, it deserves a lecture, obviously, of its own right. But we're not going to do that. So what I've done is picked one person who wrote about it, I think, better than most. And that's a man called Fintan O'Toole. He writes for the Irish Times. Some of you may be aware of him. When he's good, he's very, very good. And when he's bad, he's still good.
Very good last time.
Was he not? Some people hate Fintan O'Toole, right? But Fintan O'Toole writes not just for the Irish Times, he writes for the New York Book Review, he writes for the Guardian, he writes for all kinds of people. He's a very important commentator in the situation, right? So I picked Fintan to kind of give a quick overview, because he wrote this piece, which I'm going to read to you, an extract from it. He wrote this before Brexit had happened, before the vote had happened, right? And it's quite interesting from that point of view. He says, when you strip away the rhetoric, Brexit is an English nationalist movement. If the Leave side wins the referendum, it will almost certainly be without a majority in either Scotland or Northern Ireland, and perhaps without winning Wales either. He got that right, except for the Wales bit. Scotland voted against, Northern Ireland voted against, and Wales voted for, which shocked everybody, apart from the Welsh. The passion that animates Brexit is English self-assertion. And the inexorable logic of Brexit is the logic of English nationalism. The interesting thing about this is what Fintan O'Toole is saying is that Brexit is about the thing that I suppose England and other countries have accused Ireland of being overly jealous about, which is nationalism. And that the irony of it is that within Brexit, England became more nationalistic than even Ireland. This is what he's claiming within this. And of course, the irony of all of that is that England doesn't see itself as just being England. It sees itself as being Britain. It sees itself as being one of four nations. And yet, the nationalism seems to be mostly coming from the English dimension of Britain. Because it doesn't include Scotland, who voted against it, and Northern Ireland, who voted against it. Over time, the main political entity most likely to emerge from Brexit is not a Britain with its greatness restored or a sweetly reunited kingdom. It is a standalone England, because Scotland will have a second referendum on independence, is what he's predicting, which is most likely, and this time with the lure of staying in the European Union. Many people say that the independent referendum in Scotland, which happened a number of years ago, was lost narrowly because people were frightened of economic realities, but that this time around, the Scottish Nationalist Party will have the argument that England is going to bring us out of Europe, and that is going to damage us economically. Because Scotland will, I don't know the figures on this, but that Scotland will probably be quite badly affected by leaving Europe. And that will encourage people to vote yes to leave, is what the argument is. Scotland will have a second referendum on independence, this time with the lure of staying in the European Union. Northern Ireland will be in a horrendous bind, cut off from the rest of the island by a European border, and with the UK melting around it. Its future as an unwanted appendage of a shrunken Britain is unsustainable. And then he goes on to talk about Wales. We're not worried about Wales. My point is that most people see Brexit as a disaster. I don't. Correct. I see it through the eyes of a very narrow perspective of Northern Ireland. And from that perspective, Brexit is a godsend. Because Brexit brings us to a position of demanding a redefinition of our relationships. And I see that as a golden, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And I think I see it happening daily around me. And I thank God for it. My fear about Northern Ireland was that it was drifting back into a small sectarian pattern, with everybody looking upon it and saying, as my mother used to say, on a bad day, what he's up to up there, nobody could put up with. Right? On a good day, when things had happened, she would say, God love to you up there. But on a bad day, when we were bad people, she would say, who could put up with you? And I think it was drifting back into that narrow divide of sectarianism, with the two governments well away kind of about other issues,
Yes.
ignoring us, and ignoring some of the big issues. And Brexit came along, and it came right through the middle of that situation. And it forces us out of the smallness of Northern Ireland, out into the British-Irish situation, and the redefining of who we are and how we relate to each other. And I see that as a glorious opportunity. Some people worry about the border. My view on that is, and I've written on this, and I wrote early on this, and I worried that I was being too extreme, and that I was being perhaps a little bit naive. Because my view on this, on the border, is that there is never, ever, ever again going to be a border on the island of Ireland. And I do not care who thinks there will be one. That's a very extreme position. That's a very arrogant position. And the fear was, it could have been wrong. But I have got more arrogance even now. I would state even stronger. There will never, ever, ever again be a border in the United America. And one of the silliest things that I saw was that people, sorry, you all right? People began to argue about how will this happen and how will it not happen. And the biggest, when a lot of the frills were taken away, the big argument was from the British side was, we don't want a hard border, and if there's going to be a hard border, it'll have to be the European, it'll be the European Union who will impose it. On the other hand, the European Union was saying, and the European Union included Ireland within this, that if there's going to be a hard border, it's your English, you started this, you have to solve it, you give us the solution. Otherwise, there has to be a border. Because the European Union has to have a border if there is a customs division. My view was, not a problem. We solved the border problem a long time ago. There is no border problem. And nobody is going to resurrect it. They may try, they may dream it up, they may think about it, but it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for a number of reasons. First of all, the border, the last border we had was a security border. And before that, we had a customs border. And the customs border pretty well disappeared 20 years, well, 30 years before that as the trouble thing. And that was replaced by the security border. And then 20 years ago, the British Army took their tanks, took their guns, took their establishments, lifted them all, their sandbags and all their stuff, and their tank, and they left. And for the last 20 years, people have been free to breathe without a border. And you cannot put it back. People will not allow you to put it back. When I say they won't allow you, it is like asking people to go back to a place where they didn't want to be. And that is not possible, particularly when you look at the demographics. Because if there is a growing nationalist community, which there is, its greatest residential places is from Derry to Donegal, around that part of the border. The last census that Paul Nolan founded was that within the Boyle constituency, the people who identified themselves as British were 19%. 19% out of 100%. In Newry, it was 16.4%. And if you look at the whole border area, we are talking about, at the very highest, 18-19%. It is not doable, and it's not doable for a number of years. Let me just read you a quick piece I wrote early on in this discussion, and the Brexit thing was just coming to a head. The most bizarre has been the insinuation from both the British and the Europeans that if there is a visible border, it will be the other side's fault. The British saying that they don't want to see a physical border, and the Europeans that the British created the problem, and it's up to them to come up with a solution, as I've already said. I think neither side gets it. It's far more simple and uncomplicated. There's never, ever going to be a border in Ireland again. It doesn't matter what either of them say. The border doesn't need a solution because it is already solved. 20 or so years ago, the Irish border disappeared. The old customs posts had long disappeared, and then one day the British Army lifted their gear and went home. Most of the people felt a burden lift off their shoulders. A people who had lived in the shadow of its presence were, for the first time, free of the inconvenience and the scar of the landscape. Since then, they have lived with that freedom, and they have judged it to be right and good, and they have no intention of giving it up. To put it crudely, the British Army isn't big enough, and the Europeans don't have an army, so there isn't a problem. There's not going to be a border in Ireland. And the silliest talk of all is about the Irish government having to police a border in Ireland. It is reported that the Irish Revenue and Customs people were up looking around them a few months back, identifying possible customs posts. And I asked the question, were they out of their tiny little minds? The Irish government policing a border ever again in this part of Ireland is as big an oxymoron, I was talking about oxymorons, as the border itself. Any Irish government who tried that on would last about a month in power. The media in general don't get it either. This isn't about bandit country, or dissident Republicans, or smugglers. This is about there being a time in the affairs of men. This is about how the water flows when the dam bursts. This is about nature reclaiming disturbed ground. Even the more enlightened get it wrong. Bertie Ahern began a very good speech that he gave in Dublin by talking about there could be a border, possibly an infrastructure imposed. And then I noticed that Bertie came on to Matt's crowd about a year ago. Bertie is now claiming that there cannot be a border in Ireland. Anyway, if there can't be a border in Ireland, then what happens? Not our problem. My theory, my proposition, is that the Europeans and the British have to solve it. But they shouldn't solve it around the possibility of any kind of border in Ireland. Right? Solve it outside of that. The interesting thing is that that's what's beginning to happen. We are very close to that moment when the British are saying we have to stay within the customs union and we possibly have to stay within the single market. Not quite got to the single market yet, but we're heading in that direction. But the interesting thing is that they are now all beginning to say, in my opinion, we can't do this around the border. It has to be done without a border in Ireland. I didn't, by the way, say that there couldn't be a border on the Irish Sea. I didn't say that. I did say on the land. Which brings me to the next part of the puzzle. And the next part of the puzzle is the relationships in Northern Ireland and the greater relationships between Britain and Ireland and Scotland and Wales. Within that, let's look at Northern Ireland for a start. We have no government in Northern Ireland, and there appears to be a breakdown in relationship or a souring of relationship between the British government and the Irish government, who are fighting over the Brexit issue, or at least do not seem to have the closeness of relationship that was present during the last 20 years. And some people are worried about that. I'm not. I think that will be solved. I think that will be overcome. Which leaves us with the situation of what is going to happen in Northern Ireland. Because we do not have a government, the DUP and Sinn Féin are on two very different sides of this particular fence. Well, that's going to be very interesting, and how that works out is, I suppose, yet not fully clear. If one's being honest about that, it's not fully clear. Part of it is that the DUP in particular, and unionism, is actually blaming the Irish government for having become very involved in this issue and having become very nationalistic in their language and in their tone. And in fact, last Saturday, Sammy Wilson accused Rio Varadkar of being nationalistic and being burying his head in the sand and being antagonistic towards the unionist people. Now, within the middle of all of that comes another issue to complicate this. Within the Good Friday Agreement, within that settlement which brought an end to violence, maybe not full peace, but brought an end to at least to the violence, or to the greatest number of violent actions, and to the ultimate dissolution and going away of the IRA, and the settling down into a possible accommodation which didn't quite work out politically, and which didn't really change the relationships, but at least brought us to a better place, and gave us a bit of space and a bit of rest and a bit of peace for a period of time. We have now within that rather big issues, because part of the Good Friday Agreement said that at some moment, when it looked as if the demographics had changed enough for a border poll to actually win over the situation into an All-Ireland situation and away from a British situation, then that would have to be implemented. That would have to be accommodated. And it would have to be accommodated by the Secretary of State at that particular time. Let me go back now. What the Good Friday Agreement says is that if the Secretary of State deems that there is a strong possibility, or a possibility, that a border poll would result in a majority of people voting that the country would be unified, then they have to call a border poll. So of course, the people who are most strong in calling for the border poll, and calling for it up to a couple of hours ago, if you heard the news between Martina Anderson and the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland in a rather ugly spat at the Balmoral show, they are saying we should have a border poll, Sinn Féin, which they have every right to do and call for, because it's within the Good Friday Agreement. It was quite interesting that the chairman of the Sinn Féin this morning on a radio interview, when pushed as to when that border poll should happen, he said, well, it could happen next year, or it could happen in 7 years' time. There's a rather big gap between next year and 7 years' time, but it's interesting, at least, that he acknowledged that that could take a period of time. So the spat in some ways is twofold, and the dynamics are fascinatingly complex and tense at this moment of time, and they incorporate a number of issues. They incorporate that the demographics have changed from 100 years ago to a situation whereby it's been predicted that there will be a nationalist majority within a number of years' time. It is complicated by the fact that Brexit is happening and relationships are soured at this moment of time. It is complicated by the fact that there is a strong nationalistic party, both north and south of this island, who are saying to the British government and to the Unionist people, it is written into the agreement that there should be a border poll, and we want it called. So it appears as if relationships could not be worse. It appears as if it's all very negative and antagonistic. And it is. It is. People are getting very passionate around this stuff. There's a wonderful play, I don't know if you ever saw it. Wonderful play. And I can't even remember the name of it, it's so long ago since I saw it. But it had Liam Neeson in it, and it had the actor from Coleraine, Liam Neeson, and who's the boy from Coleraine? Yes, James Nesbitt. And it was about reconciliation. And one of them had been involved in the killing of the other person's brother. And they were being brought together for TV cameras to have a reconciliation. And it didn't happen because Nesbitt walked out. Because really all he wanted to do was to kill the other guy. Right? But the point of the play was that there was a big scrap, a big fight. And the reconciliation really was that they had fought themselves out and they reconciled not in great harmony and in great love. They reconciled in, I've had enough of this.
Pure exhaustion.
Pure exhaustion and a recognition that this had gone on. Right? And to leave it alone. How Ireland and Britain reconciles itself within the next number of years, nobody quite knows. My hope, and my wished for hope, was that there would be a great political coming together, a bit like the Good Friday Agreement, where there would be a recognition of the various strands and the various relationships between England and Scotland and England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales and so forth, and that in some ways people would say, let's redefine these relationships and let's see, Scotland perhaps wants to go independent, Northern Ireland needs to be a mixture of Irish and Britain, how do we work that out? How do we construct the situations? Do we create a unified state but with a very strong British element in it, and so forth? All of that I would have hoped might have happened. I am told by those who are reasonably close to the action at this moment of time that the possibility of that happening is zilch, and that we shouldn't dream those dreams. So if we cannot dream those dreams, what can we hope for? And I think what we can hope for is a pragmatic response to a very complex, very deep-seated and very old and historical position and complexity. I think what we can hope for is that, first of all, that we don't have a border patrol. I am not a believer in a border patrol. I think that will result in more antagonism, even if this demographics have changed. If the demographics have changed and everybody acknowledges that that's the way it should be and that's the way it has to be because everybody agreed to that, and that say 60% of the people vote for United Ireland, so 40% of the people in Northern Ireland are left with having to be forced into or being welcomed into an all-Ireland situation. I still think that will leave major hurts and anger and bitterness that will be incredibly difficult, if near impossible to reconcile. So what I think should happen within those relationships? I think that there are voices within the Unionist Protestant community who are capable of reading the signs of the time, and who are capable of actually challenging their own people to face up to some of these signs of the time, and to begin to speak out of themselves and to speak for themselves, and to speak in a fashion that is mature and that bears and that brings some wisdom with it. There was a letter about 5 months ago that got a fair amount of publicity coming from a unionist group of people. If you remember, there was a group of people sent a letter to the Taoiseach, to Denis Bradley at the time, from the nationalists, what was called civic nationalism. And about a month later, a letter came from a group of unionists calling themselves civic unionists, saying what? I'm not too sure in the letter. It was a rather vague letter. And the truth of the matter is that there is a great vagueness around Brexit even within the unionist community. Even though the northern people voted, the majority of people voted against Brexit, and probably that had to have included quite a number of unionist people, there is very few voices out of that community who are speaking with any authority and with any conviction. And unionism is slow to speak, and sometimes it doesn't speak at all. It lets some of its more extreme people shout. And therefore it gets fearful of actually moving in and speaking with the type of maturity and with the type of insight that it should and sometimes have in a more quiet place. I still have a hope that that voice will find itself, and that voice will begin to speak, and that people within the business community, within the churches, within the academic world, within the professional world, and within the community leadership world, that people will begin to read the signs of the time, will begin to understand the demographics, will begin to talk about how do we live within this island. And I think that whatever happens, it is true that the economy of this island is coming together by the day, and it's coming closer by the day, and it is much more wise to come together. And it has, in fact, very few options but to come together at all kinds of levels. And I think unionism has a pragmatism, which, if it is encouraged, will find that voice. There are many commentators who are telling the Irish government, oh, be careful, don't drive unionism too far, don't take them out of their comfort zone. I'm not a believer in that. I believe the Irish government have to be very strong at the moment. I think that they have to be very determined at the moment, and I think that they have every right to speak for all of the people of this island. Maybe not for unionism, but certainly for nationalism in Northern Ireland and for the rest of the Ireland. And I think that they should do that, and to be fair, on the whole, they have been doing it pretty well. I think that they need to continue to do that, and I think that the hope is that out of that will come a more resolute and more courageous position from within unionism itself. I believe that the relationship between England and Ireland will heal itself in a very pragmatic way. It's already doing it. Varadkar meets May today to decide about Europe, and she's informing him as to perhaps we have to increase the number of years to get out of Europe. That's what we're being told is probably on the table, and it's probably about extending the customs union beyond the date of 2021. I think was the last date, which was the extended date to 2023, and with no real end to that. I think that will even become more. That will become more realistic and worked out better within the next couple of months as the European Union sits down with the English government or with the British government and works that out. There is a difficulty in England, which we have to look at and we have to appreciate, and even though sometimes we will take great delight in it, we should be careful that we shouldn't take too much delight. It is sinful to take too much delight in the infighting between the two sides, between Remain and Brexit. England is a fine country. There are many, many, many thousands and millions of excellent people within England. And I think Brexit was not so much about Europe. I think it was much more about the economics of what was happening. And there is certainly a strand in the English history which was sometimes hard for those of us who were on the receiving end of it to take, which was a superior attitude, which resulted in the colonial mentality. But it is not the totality of England. It is not the totality of the whole of England. And I think that the Irish and the British will work out a situation, and they will come to a better place. They may not be hugging each other. It may not be, complete forgiveness of all the things of throughout the years. But it will be based on economics and politics and the realities. It will be based on the type of situation which says, well, excuse me, things are now so bad economically that we have to cooperate with each other. We can't afford to build major specialist hospitals everywhere on these islands, both between England and Scotland. And that we will build one in Wales for some specialism, and the Ireland will use it and partly pay for it. What happened in Derry recently on the cancer service is a perfect example of how things will develop in the future. Because specialisms, particularly within the health thing, are becoming so expensive that you best share them when you have the opportunity. We shared that. Very shortly after that, we shared children's heart conditions in Dublin. We closed Belfast and we opened Dublin. It took us 4 or 5 years to work out the complexity of all of that and to get through the politics of that. But we got through them and we got there. We will get there through this. I have great hope and I have great belief in Europe. Because Europe and the whole European project comes out of the hurt and the bitterness and the violence of our 2 world wars. And Europe knows this stuff well. And I think Europe will remember this stuff well. And I think Europe, on the whole, deals with this stuff well. I don't believe, like a lot of other people, that Europe is perfect. I don't think it is sinless. I don't think it's without its faults. I think it has many, it has got big and burdensome and bureaucratic. It has got arrogant at times. Got all of those things. But at its core, it knows how to cooperate. It knows how to make deals. It knows how to avoid the clash that leads to violence. It knows that politics is about the art, not just of the possible, but actually the art of avoiding war. That was its big learning, and that is its biggest contribution to modern history. And that, I don't think, was strong enough within the Brexit debate. And I don't think that came to the fore in the way. I also think that they understand the relationship between North and South of Ireland. And I think that they will be as helpful, in general, as they possibly can be. Does that mean that I don't think that they need to be coaxed and kept on their toes? I do. I think all of those things need to happen. But I'm incredibly hopeful about the future. I see the definitions being driven to the point of where it's real. It's not false. People are being asked and made and forced into talking real stuff. They might fight with each other initially, they might shout and roar at each other, but they are actually shouting and roaring about real things and about real definitions and about real relationships. I think part of what will happen in the near future is some kind of, to even complicate the matter even further, some kind of renewal of antagonism between Scotland and England. We saw the beginnings of it yesterday, where Scotland says, we're not going to accept your bill. I think that's going to turn into a real dogfight. But I think that too will settle. I think that will come to a place where people will actually come to know that it is best dealt with in an overall context. I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't think anybody fully knows what it looks like. I don't think it's going to look a lot different from what we have at this moment in time. But I do think that it forces us out into the open, to where those relationships are actually equalized to a point of where people can actually cooperate with each other, and that they lose their arrogance and they lose the difference to where the point is where they say we have to come to this position. That will mean that some people will be set aside. And I think the people who will lose out on this are the right wing of the Brexiteers. Because I will finish on this note. This is not new. The right wing of the Brexiteers is not new. And it is not new to this story. It is not new to this narrative. When the peace process started to kick in Northern Ireland, when that statement from Brooke that there was no selfish interest or economic selfish interest in Northern Ireland or in Ireland from the British government. At that time, John Major was the Prime Minister of England, and John Major was under. He had a majority in the House of Commons of 12. I think it was 12, which is actually kind of an echo into the present, the DUP having 12 members, which gives the Conservatives the majority. But leaving that aside, there was a group of backbenchers, I think 20 in all, who were incredibly antagonistic towards two things. One was talking to the area. They were utterly antagonistic to any possibility that the British government would sit down and talk to the Republican movement in Ireland. And Major knew that he could possibly lose his premiership over that. The second thing they were incredibly antagonistic towards was Europe. The group who are now leading the charge against Europe are kind of a forward throw of that same group. I think that group will lose. I think that group has to lose. I don't mean that they should be humiliated, I just mean they have to politically lose. And I think when they lose, and I think is inevitable, then I think that a lot of this stuff will actually, when we look back at it in 100 years, somebody will stand in this or similar room and say, those were the moment when these islands actually got themselves together in a fashion that hadn't happened up to then. And the future became brighter as a result of that. I hope that is true. Thank you.
I think you're right about the business about borders. If you're of a certain age, pardon me, and you have witnessed, customs and then the British security, and that goes, you're not worried about it, and you know yourself. As you say, it's just not going to come to pass, I don't think. And people of sort of our generation would be saying that, look, we've seen all that now, and no way is it coming back again. So I think you're right. You're right about that. We won't get too overworked about it, like the younger ones maybe don't think.
I think there's a lot of talk, particularly in the DUP, but also from this thing I call maximum facilitation, which is about putting up cameras and things like that, right? And a solution around customs issue around about what I call digital and all this type of stuff. I think if cameras go away, I've thought this from the start, it wouldn't be the dissidents who would be the problem. I think the local farmer would be the problem. I think he could just pull it down. Now, that might be wrong with this, but I do think he'd pull it down. I don't mean farmers from the west. Joe Coyle would pull it down. A chance, right? They go up the pole within 2 minutes and they pull it. I think the young ones around the place would be telling the stones, and nobody would stop them because they would think, that's my feeling. I don't want, I just think that, anyway, that's what I think. Sorry, any questions?
Yeah, put it out is right, but the only thing I see, one of the problems now, the next few years, the centenaries, anniversaries of, partition, the border, Civil War, all that sort of thing, Can you see any danger in that, or what way should we react to that, or?
We thought that the anniversary, the centenary of 1916 could be a problem, and it turned out to be a wonderfully held, a wonderfully managed event. And it was wonderfully managed because what happened was that breadth was put into it. It wasn't kind of the wee narrow story about 1916 and the rising. It was what happened to the children, what was the woman's story within it, what was the economic story within it, what was the consequences. It was a big, broad narrative which was incredibly powerful and very moving. And I don't think anybody could have taken any great exception to it as a piece of historical remembrance. I'm hoping that a lot of the same type of breadth will be brought into these coming commemorations. Maybe they won't, but I think that they might be. I think people are learning. I think that what happened in the last few years was a good example, and I'm hoping that some of that, at least, if not all of it, will happen around the more difficult ones in some ways, the Civil War one. The Civil War one's a big difficulty one, but I'm hopeful about that. The Northern one is difficult, but again, I think that unionism has a tale to tell.
It's true,
right? I mean, my good unionist friends say this, and they say it well. They say, we're very bad at telling our story. And I think that is true. And I think that they need to learn, or they need to begin to tell that story a bit better than they've told it. Sometimes I think they're embarrassed by the story. And therefore they leave out the good things as opposed to, and as well as the bad things. And I think if they began to tell that story, I mean, the weakness in my argument, big weakness in my argument, up to this moment of time, is the unionist voice beginning to speak into the future. I don't see any sign of it, even though I'm pleading for it. I mean, I've written about 3 articles in the Irish Times recently, more or less the same article with different guises, pleading to union. And the reason I put it in the Irish Times is because a lot of unionists read the Irish Times.
Yeah.
I don't put it in the Irish News, which I write for sometimes, because I don't think they read it as much. So I don't kind of go that down. But I put it in there with 3 articles now, and it's been this kind of cry to the unionist people to find a voice and to speak into that voice, which is into the voice of the demographics are changing. We realise that. It doesn't mean they're going to change overnight, and it doesn't mean things are going to happen overnight, but we need to begin that process of speaking about this and about, we had terrible things like Arlene Foster saying, "I'll get out if it happens." Peter Robinson said, "Can never happen. It'll never happen." Well, excuse me, Peter, it just might, right? Because under the agreement, there is the border vote, right? And I'm saying to Sinn Féin, which I didn't develop on this particular night, but because it's almost too complex, is that I think the last people to lead this, and I wrote an article last week, part of which pleaded to Sinn Féin to be unselfish, because they're the last people to lead the charge.
Right. Yeah.
Because they're like a red flag to a bullet when it comes to this issue. And the people they should leave the future around unity to is to the Irish government, to the political parties down here, and to civic nationalism. And that I did say at the end that would be the greatest sacrifice since Easter Rising. Right? So if you're talking about sacrifice, no, I think the possibility of Sinn Féin doing that are such. But again, I think people need to be challenged. And sometimes they don't want to hear the challenge, and they do because I or somebody else says it, doesn't mean they'll hear it. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't be said. It should be spoken at least. But the commemorations are difficult, but I'm more hopeful than I would have been. And I'm not too sure people were as convinced before the last ones that they could go off so well as they did.
But even again, on that one, there was a county committee I was on it, like, that were set up under the county council, and it was representative of all the political parties. And in fairness to that, they say that there was a lot of common ground in it, and they didn't, like, people were afraid that somebody would go off on their own, and that didn't happen. It was very well managed, right?
I do remember, I was driving to Cork on, I think it was the Easter Monday, and I remember listening to RT the whole way down, and it was on the whole day, and it did different aspects and different programs. And I remember I just thought it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. The breath was magnificent. That's what I thought.
Sure. Excellent lecture, Denis. Thank you very much for coming. I was just thinking, based on what you were just saying there, is there a possibility that given you have so many, what I would describe as bad actors in the British government, who have their own agenda, and that the British English people, as you correctly identified, many of them are determined, well, at least say a couple of percent want Brexit no matter what. And given the extremism of the DUP, that there might be another outcome rather than one we've been considering tonight. Particularly going back to almost what I think maybe in the first sentence you mentioned about Edward Carson's purveyor of that the border could retract towards the Antrim, Armagh and Donegal, and that would solve maybe a lot of problems for a lot of people, including the demographic changes that are happening. And it might be a place where, well, maybe a lot of people would be happy with the hard border there and wouldn't be too concerned about it. Could you see there's any chance or possibility that something like that, given the people who are involved, that they might panic to get what they want?
That's a very good question. And it's not beyond possibility.
I've thought about this recently because it is something, the fact, as you said about the partition, it's already happened, you know, and the country's made up and people find themselves on the wrong side of the line, unionists and nationalists. And I just think people are a bit complacent, like they were about home rule, and then 5-6 years later, there was an independent country. And when people would go fighting for independence, they never considered that there would be partition. And we're maybe sleepwalking again, there's something like this, or something nobody's thought about.
The difficulty with it is that your capital city has become a national city, which wouldn't have been true in 1920. Demographics in Belfast have changed enormously. I mean, a lot of the areas that I'm told, I don't know the area very well, but I'm told that a lot of the people who left Belfast, and a lot of people that moved up towards Carrickfergus and Larne and that kind of coastline there. And I mean, it is a major issue, it's a major problem. In some ways, will they go back to Randolph Churchill thing, you know, Ulster will fight and Ulster will be right, you know, but that could be an outcome, and all my optimism could be fanciful.
Yes, I'm kind of putting the more pessimistic view.
No, and rightly so, and it's not without, you know, it has roots within the history. Therefore, it has possibilities, you know. Things are not inclined to grow on a surface of concrete. They grow on things where there's already been growth. And Carson certainly thought that the 4 counties could survive. And there was always a possibility of repartition. That was floated. That has been floated from time to time. Belfast is the problem. As I say, because it's a capital city. The other side that's very difficult, I mean, unionist loyalism could kind of revolt and fight. The difficulty they have is, how do they fight against? They either become, you know, they either are forced into a crude sectarianism that is so ugly to everybody, including themselves, or else they fight the police, whom they claim to be their own, or the British Army, whom they claim to be their own. So it becomes a kind of a surreal situation that is, you know, I'm not saying they couldn't have a life for a week or a month or 2 months, but to have a life for 3 or 4 years would be incredibly difficult. That's my only hope and the only reason I reject it. But I don't fully reject it. I mean, I'm not rejecting it, but I think those are part of the reasons why, you know, looking at the worst part of it, I think that it's unlikely for those reasons, but I wouldn't rule it out as being the worst scenario and the one that possibly that needs to be thought a little bit about, and that's why I don't like the border poll. I think the border poll could lead to that. Right? I don't want to say that too strong, but I don't want to ignore it either. I would prefer that the voice comes from within unionism itself and has a debate within itself and argues and fights among itself, because the argument will release itself, or the passions at least will be more released if there's arguments and fights and different opinions, and then responses which are much more mature from all sides, from the British, from the Irish, and from civic nationalism and so forth. I think that there could be some kind of reconciling within that. I think the border poll is just too crude.
Yeah, I agree with you there about
Can I just say this, finish it? I wouldn't take border poll off the table, by the way.
No.
There's a difference between me thinking it's too crude, but I think it has to be there. Sorry.
I agree with what you were saying about that there are certain voices you started to hear. I've heard a few people that are kind of, as you say, more mature or more reconciliatory, but I think Brexit is happening too soon for that. As you said, maybe 10, 20 years down the line, this would be a better place, but this is going to happen. If there's no agreement in October, it's going to happen on 29th of March next year, and it's maybe just all happened too soon.
Awesome.
Well, Hope I'd rather see your version.